Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to open Our Watch's Sharing Practice webinar on the topic of resistance and backlash in the primary prevention of violence against women. We have an impressive group of researchers and practitioners joining the session today. And we at Our Watch thank them for being here and look forward to hearing them share their practice wisdom with people across the country, people who are also engaged in important transformative change work. I would like to first and foremost open the session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia on which we work and live. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples past and present. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining the session today. I will also take this moment to acknowledge that our work is further informed by many women, women's organisations and survivor advocates who've lived with and spoken out about resistance for decades. The work we are doing here builds on their legacy, their dedication, and their advocacy. It's critical that we continue to include the voices of all women when seeking to prevent violence and all forms of inequality. My name is Mel Kullan, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people in Meanjin. I'm wearing a floral shirt and pink glasses. I work with the Prevention and Action Directorate at Our Watch, and I'm proud to be part of the sector engagement team who are dedicated to supporting the needs of the national prevention sector. If you don't already know, Our Watch is a national leader in the prevention of violence against women and their children in Australia. We work to embed gender equality and prevent violence where Australians live, learn, work, and socialise. We recognise that violence against women is widespread and touches the lives of many people. Please remember that it's normal to have a strong reaction to what we'll be talking through today. You may want to chat with someone following our session. You can contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732. For men with questions about their relationships, anger, or mental health, please contact Men's Referral Service on 1300-766-491. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers, please reach out to 13-YARN on 139276. Before we make a start today, I would like to let you know how you can engage with our presenters and panelists during the session. We do have a live Q&A platform, and the button is at the bottom of your screen. Time will be allocated about partway through the program to allow for your initial questions to be answered. We'll also ask that you give some attention to the following online etiquette so that we can maintain an inclusive learning space. First, please keep your questions and comments respectful. Moderators will exclude people or discussion that justifies, excuses, trivialises, or downplays violence against women, that indicates a threat to the safety or well-being of a person, or is disrespectful or derogatory. Overall, we're aiming to have a robust discussion on a challenging topic while also holding space for diverse views. Speakers themselves come from many opinions and viewpoints. We ask that you keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or position of Our Watch. Lastly, I'm happy to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to registered participants after the event. So based on that, you can sit back, relax, and take in the conversation. So now it's my privilege to introduce our MC for today's conversation and panel on resistance and backlash. Natalie Wade is a respected disability rights lawyer and advocate. Natalie is an authentic leader who believes in designing law reform, public policy, and community campaigns through lived experience and expertise. Natalie holds several senior advisory roles, including on the Australian Disability Strategy Advisory Council and the Premier's Council for Women. We're also very fortunate to have had Natalie work with Our Watch in the consultations for the Government Action Plan for Our Watch's Changing the Landscape, a national resource to prevent violence against women and girls with disabilities. Welcome, Natalie, and thanks for guiding us through the webinar today.
Thanks so much, Mel, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. As mentioned, my name is Natalie, and I am, by way of image description, a white woman wearing a black and white scarf with long brown hair and glasses. We've had over 200 people registered to join us today from across Australia and maybe even internationally. I'm joining you from Ghana country in South Australia, and I would also like to give my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, past and present, and pay my respects to any First Nations people here today. We have an interesting program of topics today. To begin with, we will hear from our watchers, Dr. Sarah Hewitt, who authored the report titled Understanding, Monitoring and Responding to Resistance and Backlash, a publication prepared for Respect Victoria in 2022. As organisers of the webinar, we really wanted to bring the report to light and provide an opportunity for practitioners to consider the challenges and opportunities that resistance presents in the course of doing prevention work. After hearing from Sarah, we will have a panel of speakers from all parts of the country and from diverse professional and personal backgrounds who have experienced resistance and backlash. They will share their stories and let us know what worked for them and how they stay strong in the course of transformative change work. Stay with us through to the later part of the program, where Dr. Hewitt will be sharing a framework for responding to and planning for resistance. Today, we're going to talk about the incredibly important topics of backlash and resistance in the context of prevention of violence against women. Dr. Sarah Hewitt, a thought leader and author on this topic, is going to share with us what backlash and resistance looks like in an individual, community, and collective organisational and institutional context. As we hear from the expert panel, we will learn about what the impact of backlash and resistance can look like in practice. Understanding and tackling backlash and resistance in the modern context is important more now than ever before, where opportunities for tactics of backlash and resistance through social media and mainstream media coverage are more frequent now than ever before. It is critical that we understand what it is and how to address it. The current context is also considerate of the marginalisation of our trans community and female identifying people who must be recognised, and the impact of backlash and resistance specifically against them, prevented and guarded against. It is important that we look after each other today in the conversation and walk together to learn, discuss, and understand the impact of backlash and resistance in preventing violence against women. I would like to now introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Sarah Hewitt. Since completing her PhD with the Monash University's Gender, Peace and Security Centre, Sarah has worked as an educator and in policy and practice, focusing on gender equality and preventing sexual and gender-based violence. Since 2020, Sarah has worked with Our Watch, leading on a number of projects, including research for the publication Understanding, Monitoring and Responding to Resistance and Backlash in Organisational and Institutional Settings. the National Primary Prevention Hub, and contributing to the evidence review of workforce development. Sarah is currently a senior policy advisor in the Government Relations Policy and Evidence Directorate at Our Watch. Thank you and welcome, Sarah.
So much, Natalie, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And hopefully everyone can see that slide. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah. I have brown curly hair, blue eyes. I'm a white woman. I'm wearing a dark green jumper with a light green collar. I use pronouns she, her, and I'm from Our Watch. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm joining on today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations in Naarm, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today, and recognise that sovereignty over these lands and waterways has never been ceded. So, as Natalie mentioned, I'm discussing today resistance and backlash, the different types, and some examples in how they manifest. The report on the screen informs this presentation and was the product of a joint project between Our Watch and Respect Victoria that sought to contribute to the real nascent research and evidence base on resistance and backlash to gender equality and primary prevention initiatives. So let's dive right in. Resistance and backlash is inevitable or highly likely in response to change processes that seek to transform social norms, practices and structures such as gender and other intersecting power hierarchies. In the context of work to prevent violence against women, backlash and resistance can be understood as any active or passive action, behaviour or attitude which seeks to block change, uphold the status quo of gender relations, or re-establish patriarchal privilege and power. Resistance shouldn't put off any kinds of transformative work, because if resistance is not occurring, then we have to really wonder whether a change initiative is challenging power dynamics and the status quo. And what we will highlight in part 2 of the webinar today is the importance of planning for it and ensuring the safety and well-being of people and communities who are doing the work or who are targets of backlash. So primary prevention as an approach, it really demands a social response to a social problem and seeks to engage the entire population in the task of shifting the underlying drivers of violence against women and the social context of gender inequality and other forms of oppression. But many people tend to view violence against women because of individual pathology only, rather than the gendered structures, norms and practices in which a larger group of people and communities are complicit and sometimes colluders. People are far more likely to resist the idea that they may be part of the story of violence against women and that they may contribute to the drivers of this violence in subtle and subconscious ways in their relationships, homes, workplaces, sporting and social groups and communities because of the social context of gender inequality. And few people, especially those who consider themselves to be non-violent or who have never been physically violent, may not want to acknowledge and address this complicity. And while many people do respond positively to prevention and recognise the need to play their part in preventing violence and challenging these deep-seated gendered norms and practices, this population-wide approach elicits a breadth of resistance. Therefore, all forms of resistance and backlash can create challenges for prevention work and make the goal of gender transformational change to end violence against women more difficult to achieve. So backlash and resistance are in and of themselves reinforcing factors of violence against women, as outlined in Change the Story, because they can create an environment which heightens the risk of violence. So resistance to primary prevention is both a collective and individual response, and can come from across communities and populations. It occurs across settings in which primary prevention and gender equality initiatives are developed and implemented, and across the socio-ecological model. Individual resistance and backlash can be displayed by anyone who seeks to maintain anyone who seeks to maintain the status quo of gender relations, holds sexist attitudes, or helps create or maintain settings or contexts characterised by sexism, gender segregation, and male dominance. For example, when masculinity, privilege, or status is challenged, men who hold such attitudes may respond by using harassing, sexist, homophobic, or sexually objectifying behaviours, or with increased anger and physical aggression towards women. Therefore, resistance and backlash can also be part of the dynamics of intimate partner violence. Community or collective backlash and resistance often occurs in response to specific incidents or situations, and includes coordinated resistance by informal groups or communities. For example, there has been significant and coordinated resistance, including anti-feminist backlash in response to some aspects of family law that men's rights and fathers' rights groups perceive to be unfair to men. This has sought to discredit female victims of violence, wind back some legal protections to victims and the penalties imposed on perpetrators, and undermine violence against women services. Organisational resistance and backlash can take a range of forms. It includes, for example, resistance to gender equality measures or to women's career advancement, and this may manifest as hostility towards and harassment of women, negative judgment about women's competence in the workplace based on gender norms and stereotypes, intimidation, sabotage, or excessive scrutiny of women's work. At the institutional and system level of the socio-ecological model, resistance is best understood as an ongoing pattern. It can be explicit or implicit and is characterised by patterns of individual and collective action or inaction. It can include watering down or removing institutional measures to address the gender drivers of violence, or the filtering out of transformative primary prevention efforts and gender equality goals. Structural and systemic backlash and resistance occurs in response to changes or perceived changes to the social status of women within a society, and increased public and political focus on issues related to women's safety, empowerment, and equality. So resistance and backlash to prevention work also intersects with resistance to other forms of equality and rights-based social change. It can be amplified, sometimes dangerously so, when feminism and anti-sexism work intersects with the work of other movements, such as those seeking justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or people and groups seeking to dismantle systemic racism or homo and transphobia. Those working at the intersection of such work may be more likely to encounter severe and aggressive resistance and backlash, sometimes more frequently, and such discriminatory views can often be held by the same people in similar positions of power. For example, primary prevention interventions that challenge gender norms, the gender binary, and homo, bi, and transphobia can elicit backlash and resistance that can often be severe and violent. And this is particularly prevalent in the current socio-political environment, globally and in Australia, that is seeking to reverse gains in LGBTIQA+ rights, especially anti-trans backlash. Ideologically right-wing and conservative groups that have been successful in reversing transgender rights in parts of the US and UK have established branches in Australia that fund and organise anti-trans activities. And there are active campaigns by organisations that spread misinformation about transgender people. And this has been connected to backlash against the trans community in Australia, such as an anti-trans rally in Melbourne, and an extensive online attacks of the trans community on social media platforms. And this can include individuals and groups that act under the guise of protecting women's rights, but seek to exclude transgender women from violence against women-related activities and services. And anti-trans backlash is deliberate and coordinated that seeks to undermine progress towards securing trans people's rights and safety, having very real ramifications on people's lives. In a recent report by the Trans Justice Project and the Victorian Pride Lobby, which is one of the most extensive samples of trans Australians ever collected, found that anti-trans hate is intensifying over time, with 8 in 10 participants reporting an increase in online anti-trans hate since 2020. 94% of survey participants saw online anti-trans abuse, harassment or vilification, and 1 in 10 trans people experienced anti-trans violence, including physical and sexual assault. And it is critical to take seriously in and of itself, as well as seeing the patterns and overlaps to broader anti-gender backlash and resistance that has serious ramifications and consequences for LGBTIQA+ rights, prevention efforts, and gender equality. So what can drive resistance and backlash? It can come from a range of communities and individuals, from those who may be ignorant or unaware of how gender inequality drives violence against women, and those are the people who may be more open to crime prevention and change, through to people and communities who aggressively oppose gender equality and primary prevention efforts, such as men's rights activists, conservative and religious groups that may promote essentialist or traditional gender stereotypes and ideas around relationships and family, and those that seek to promote the primacy of sex and the gender binary. Given some men are in positions of significant privilege and power, gender transformative change interventions like primary prevention can often produce backlash and resistance to perceived or real changes in gendered power and privilege. And while engaging men in addressing harmful forms of masculinity is critical in this work, especially when thinking about resistance and backlash, resistance does come from all parts of the community, including women and allies of prevention and the women's movement. So resistance can be rooted in fear and anxiety to change. This could be feelings of uncertainty around the future and the relinquishment of the familiar and the status quo, frustration due to a lack of control an individual or group may feel about the changes to society that are happening around them. It could be driven by concerns around perceived or actual real impacts on people and groups' privilege, such as status, opportunities, and resources. And as discussed earlier, it can be driven by extreme manifestations, such as individual and collective anti-gender beliefs and ideologies. So, although the terms backlash and resistance are often used interchangeably, backlash is the most active and deliberate form of resistance, whereas resistance as a concept captures the passive and active, implicit and explicit, formal and informal opposition to change that primary prevention promotes. And resistance can look very different depending on the setting, where you're working on the socio-ecological model, which populations and structures you are engaging with, and different forms can change over time. Now, there is no clear delineation where often you can see different forms of resistance at once, but by building our understanding of each, we can figure out ways to best respond and plan for it. And while we don't have time today to go into each of these different forms, I wanted to highlight and discuss denial, co-option, and backlash. So denial of the gender drivers of violence against women is the most common form of resistance that we see, and often underpins the kind of whole wheel or all the forms of resistance and backlash. It is denying the problem of violence against women or the legitimacy of the case for change. And this can include denying the problem exists, including minimising its extent, significance or impact. And this could be conveyed verbally and physically that gender inequality has nothing to do with violence against women. It is disbelieving and discrediting evidence that demonstrates the prevalence, severity, and gendered nature of violence against women. It could look like condoning practices that excuse sexist behaviour and viewing such behaviours as benign or not having any impacts. Denial consists of renaming and redefining violence against women out of existence, for example, by providing anecdotal evidence of female perpetrators to reject a whole of population approach to prevention. It can be denying the credibility of the message on the basis that it is supposedly irrational, untruthful, or exaggerated. For instance, attitudes around women exaggerating claims of violence or lying about the violence they experience, excusing men's violence based on essentialist masculine stereotypes, through reasoning such as it's natural for men to be more angry and violent. Factors such as mental health, alcohol consumption, or violence being out of a perpetrator's character are often highlighted, downplaying and excusing the violence itself. But on the flip side, if a woman is affected by alcohol, drugs, or is seen as sexually active, she is seen to be partly or wholly responsible for the violence she experiences. And this kind of denial consists of victim blaming that blames violence on women being intoxicated, wearing certain clothing, walking home alone at night, wearing headphones, etc. Denial can also involve denying the legitimacy of the issue by attacking the credibility of the messengers of change, by questioning their motives and marginalising them as special interest groups. So the issue becomes about the messengers rather than the message itself. And we hear this with terms such as feminazi, for example. And I wanted to highlight what about men and not more all men responses as a really common form of denial that comes up a lot in prevention work. And these kind of responses are really based on claims that men are being disadvantaged and discriminated against because of primary prevention efforts. These kinds of defensive statements really individualise the broader gendered patterns of men's violence against women. And these responses seek to shift the focus to men's experiences as victims and uses anecdotal evidence of female perpetrators, for example, rather than an understanding of the structural gender dynamics that drive the disproportionate rates of violence against women and the dominance of male perpetration in this violence. And these manifestations of resistance, so what about men and not all men, rejects the notion that we all have a part to play in critically examining our learned sexist behaviours, attitudes, and how they are embedded in the systems around us. So co-option is using progressive frameworks, goals, and language like equality, rights, justice, and so on, to defend and maintain unequal structures and practices. At first glance, these discourses portray themselves to be progressive appeals because they use the language of rights, of feminism, queer, and anti-racism work. But in reality, they are a deliberate co-option of equality-based frameworks and goals to maintain unequal structures and defend patriarchal, white, hetero, and cis-normative privilege. And co-option is a really important form of resistance to think about how primary prevention goals can be insidiously used. So, for example, the use of the term gender ideology co-ops gender discourses to repress and reverse goals of gender equality as trying to challenge the natural sex and reproductive roles between men and women and destroy traditional families and family values. Such individuals and collectives see gender equality goals as an intrusion, an interference into people's private lives. And it can often coalesce around moral panics regarding same-sex marriage, sexual and reproductive rights, LGBTIQA+ rights, and respectful relationships education in schools. And this can lead to the actual repression and dismantling of primary prevention activities. And the third and final manifestation I want to highlight is backlash. Backlash is the most extreme form of resistance, and it is exhibited through a range of aggressive and attacking discourses, behaviours and actions that deny the problem of men's violence against women and deliberately undermine primary prevention efforts and gender equality goals. It is an explicit and conscious form of resistance. It can be displayed by individuals such as anti-feminist public figures and influential people, as well as organised groups that may be seen as reputable and authoritative on such issues, such as conservative think tanks, some media organisations, and anti-LGBTIQA+ groups. Men's rights activists, or MRAs, for example, deliberately seek to undermine feminist efforts by claiming that feminism perpetuates sexism and a world where men are oppressed and primary prevention is seen as a movement that victimises men and boys and their health and well-being. And we can see backlash and this co-option in the engaging men's space, where men's rights activists have co-opted discourses around male health promotion and centre claims that male health deficits and high mortality rates are a product of anti-male sentiment and confusion around men's social and familial roles due to the achievements of gender equality movements. Anti-gender groups more generally, which display these more active forms of resistance, so co-option, repression and backlash, have increasingly become professionalised and position themselves as legitimate experts in matters related to gender, violence against women, including domestic, family and sexual violence, and men's health, and have funded networks of organisations, think tanks, as well as broader academic and civil society partnerships. And such groups, quite concerningly, operate transnationally and tend to share pseudoscientific research and disinformation to support their claims. So that's quite an extreme form of backlash, but backlash in and of itself is a continuum of reactions made by opponents of primary prevention and gender equality goals. It is predicated on essentialist understandings and patriarchal, cis and heteronormative stereotypes of women and men, where women are seen as inferior and subordinate and sometimes deserving of the violence they experience, reinforcing all the gender drivers. When people outside the bounds of gendered, heteronormative and cisnormative stereotypes, when they step outside of those boundaries, harassment, abuse and violence may be seen as justified to put people back in their gendered place. And this backlash can be compounded by other forms of discrimination, as discussed earlier. And groups and individuals who display sexist and misogynistic backlash may also engage in racism, white supremacy, ableism and homophobia, bi and transphobia. So although backlash can often be framed as this really extreme version of resistance, it can also be mainstream and in everyday discourses and behaviours in many settings, echoing and reinforcing common widespread denials of gender inequality. I think I'm out of time, so I will leave that there. That's part one, me talking. So Natalie, I'll hand back to you, and I look forward to discussing solutions in the next part of the program.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for providing that incredibly insightful presentation. And it's interesting, you know, when you talk particularly about backlash as one of the most extreme forms in which that comes. And yet, I'm sure I and many of the participants here today would say, yet so common. It's something that we see so often in our everyday lives and throughout mainstream media. So how horrifying that one of the most extreme forms is in fact one of the most common. I now have a very exciting task to introduce to you our practitioner panel who will share their own experiences of resistance with us. No doubt the experiences they will share will feature elements of the types of resistance and backlash that Sarah has just discussed. Today, the panel has Marcella Brassett, the Training and Campaigns Lead from Democracy in Colour, Grace White, LGBTIQA+ Disability Social Inclusion Officer with the National Ethnic Disability Alliance, Charlie King, OAM, a sports commentator and violence prevention campaigner from No More NT, and Lisa, Sarah and Hunter, who are facilitators of the ARC Gender Equality Project at the Men and Family Centre of New South Wales. For each panellist, I will provide a bio when I invite them to speak, so you can learn a little bit more about their important work and contributions. And it is my absolute deep honour and privilege to welcome a fellow disabled woman in Grace White from the National Ethnic Disability Alliance. Grace is a proudly queer, autistic and disabled woman. Her lived and living experience underpins project work and systemic advocacy with particular interests and expertise in the rights of people with disabilities, victims, survivors of medical violence, and LGBTIQA+ people with disability. Thank you for being with us today, Grace. If I could start by asking you, when you have faced resistance in the course of your work and life, what happened and how did you address it?
Yes, hello everyone, my name is Grace. My pronouns are she, her. As an image description, I'm a white woman wearing a pink dress here. I'm wearing glasses and have blonde hair. I'm on Darug country today. A time that I faced resistance and backlash is sort of a constant. One particular phrase that stands out is when I was told that I was throwing the baby out with the bathwater when pushing for the inclusion of voices of women with disability in the prevention of violence against women, including gender diverse, non-binary people and girls. To me, accessibility and inclusion in a movement for protection isn't actually discretionary, because if we're protecting and safeguarding women from violence, those with disability, including women at multiple intersections, should not be an afterthought and should not be able to be thought of after. I think that the progress that's been made at this space at the mainstream can actually mask the way that that same violence remains for some marginalized people in certain settings, goes unaddressed, often unnoticed. And when we do prod at that mask, that can be perceived as throwing progress out with the root problem, because as the attention has been shifted toward significant progress for the mainstream, root problems have become somewhat obscured in that process. I think it's really important to point out here that women with disability are at least 2 times as likely to experience violence than non-disabled women. Women with psychosocial disability are overrepresented even within that group. As a psychiatric survivor, I'm going to explore the impacts of saneism in my answer today. So I experience resistance and backlash ongoing through the stark contrast in policy dependent on where the violence happened, who perpetrated it, who they hurt or are currently hurting right now, and the criminalization of violence against women in certain settings versus institutional approval, but also facilitation of that same violence against women with disabilities in other settings because they are disabled. To me, that's a type of resistance, a refusal to act on just this irreconcilable hypocrisy. The way I see it, if it's violent in a home, it's violent in a hospital, it's violent in out-of-home care. And we can't construct this idea of what's violence and what's medicine, and then have that become conditional on where it happened, who did it, and who they did it to. If prevention and intervention stratify intersectionally in this way, that's a way to tell diverse women what their lives are worth and which lives are worth more than others, but also why that is. So in closed settings, chemical restraint, common practice, physical restraint, common practice, coercive control actually underpins the very nature of institutional interventions. And technology facilitated abuse, as it's recognized in domestic settings now as abusive, is actually increasing. It's considered a technological advancement in the field of psychiatry, with developments like digital phenotyping, high-tech surveillance. Then when you express a feeling of being watched, you're punished for that. So I do think that a way to address this is welcoming disabled voices, people with disability, into the prevention of violence against women, and that's the opposite of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's alerting a movement against violence to violence that's happening within its own walls. And I think of that as kindness, because if it feels like you're being forced backwards when these issues are raised, I think it could be considered like when you realize you've dropped a stitch way back at the start of knitting a scarf, and that burden of realizing you have to unravel all that way for an ultimately better outcome. Here, something needs to be unlearned, which is much slower than it is fast, but it's also necessary. When acts that are agreed upon as abusive at a mainstream level are condoned against women with disability, Engagement with disability rights is going to diversify and strengthen the collective movement, but also align it more accurately with the landscape of the issue itself, because this does proportionally, it happens twice at a rate of twice the violence to women with disability. So at a systemic and structural advocacy level, to respond to backlash and resistance, I am going to engage with the findings of the Disability Royal Commission, but I'm not just going to limit that to the final report that comes out. I am looking to mobilise the meaning of the testimonies that were so bravely shared. Disability peaks across Australia have issued a call to action: end segregation and violence against people with disability. And this includes women and girls, LGBTIQA+ people with disability, First Nations people with disability, and those from culturally and linguistically diverse migrant and refugee backgrounds. I don't think that we can extract the intersection of disability from prevention of violence against women. I actually think disability gives us one of the best insights we can get into the patriarchal structure of violence, because think of how often the DSM is used against a non-disabled woman in court to prevent justice in precisely this space that we are all here for. These aren't systems malfunctioning. I do believe that these are systems, for example, psychiatric institutions. I think that they're working remarkably well to an original design. And that seems like a malfunction because it's happening despite incredible progress in this space around them. And I think sanest progress masks the way that histories of hysteria linger for everyone, but more so for some than others. Because when you think about it, if you take violence out of the picture, what do you call a room someone is too insane to leave? So it's important, I think, for us to continue to listen, but also realize that we actually have heard enough to act now. We have heard more than enough. We don't need even one more story. So this, unfortunately, isn't history yet, but it can be. And this webinar, everyone coming here today, that's where you come in.
Thank you so much, Grace. And whilst the virtual webinar does not allow it, I'm sure I speak for every attendee and panelist when I say there is an absolute raging applause going on in our minds. That was just sensational. And the points you raise around the double statistical fact that disabled women and girls face violence at a rate compared to those without disabilities is alarming. But as you say, you know, the time to act is now, and we don't need any more evidence. We don't need any more time. It is absolutely time right now, which is the perfect moment to bring in Charlie. Charlie, AM from no more in the Northern Territory, is coming to us from Larrakia Country today. And Charlie is a proud Grundy man, a sports commentator and award-winning anti-family violence campaigner. He has spent decades working in community development, juvenile justice, child protection and family violence, alongside his work in broadcasting and commentating on sports, including Australian rules and cricket. Fortunately for me, the questions today are not about Aussie rules or cricket, of which I know nothing, but I am keen to hear from Charlie about when you have faced resistance in the course of your work and life. What happened and how did you address it? Welcome, Charlie.
Hello, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Nice to have the opportunity to be sharing my story with you. Let me just start by saying I don't see myself as an Aboriginal person. I don't see myself as Indigenous. I barely see myself as First Nations. I see myself as a Gurindji person, and people may know the Gurindji people who Gough Whitlam poured the sand in the hands of the old Vincent Lingiari to return the lands to the Gurindji people all those years ago. It's my mother's people, and I see myself very much as a Gurindji person. I was born, right, you said, on the lands of the Aranda people in Alice Springs back in the 1950s. I live in the lands of the Larrakia people and have done that since 1966. So I enjoyed my time here in the top end of Australia. I first got involved and interested in this particular work when I had been working in a timber yard, selling timber, and I got approached by a man who asked me whether I wouldn't mind doing some work dealing with Aboriginal people. And because my mother had brought me up to always think that one day I would do that work, I took that opportunity and had a chance to travel around the Northern Territory, meeting with different tribal groups, so many different tribal groups. And I want to throw the word in there, tribal, because I want us to start thinking about Aboriginal people in terms of their tribal groups, whatever tribal group. As I said, mine's Gurindji, but there are a whole range of different tribal groups, and I think it's important for us to have pride in the tribe. Certain opportunities to work with a lot of Aboriginal people, and I found that work challenging and important, and I did it for quite some time. I eventually finished up working in juvenile justice, as Natalie mentioned, there for quite some time with young people going to court, not just Aboriginal people, but all young people who were going to court, and did lots of work with them. And I went on to work more in working with families, different family groups in the top end. But I found something interesting. I was the only male to be working in that space, in that particular area. And I kept thinking to myself, where are the men? Why aren't the men involved in this work? Why aren't the men here when we're having these discussions around dysfunctional families and children moving from the welfare system to the justice system? Why aren't we talking about that? And I tried to set it up and just couldn't quite get it happening. Called the same few men would turn up, 3 or 4 at a time. We'd have a bit of a talk, but they wouldn't do anything. Anyway, I eventually got an opportunity to work away from that because I was starting to work with a lot of people who were actually families that worked with children who were in the justice system or children in the welfare system. And wherever I went around the territory, people would see me at a restaurant and say, oh, that's that guy that works with blah, blah, blah. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to be seen to doing that. And I got the opportunity to actually work at the ABC as a sport broadcaster. And I took that opportunity. I didn't realise then how useful that might be in the years to come. So I spent quite a lot of time. And you mentioned we're not talking about the footy, and we are talking about the footy, but I will say part of my new job at the ABC was to be calling football matches. And that was really important to engage and connect with Aboriginal men and all those tribal groups around the Northern Territory, because our live broadcast would go out on a Saturday and the replay would go on a Sunday morning, and we'd hear of groups of men sitting down to watch the football matches because they loved it. And I then got a call from a department asking me whether, because I was known around the Northern Territory, would I travel around and talk to communities about pornography? Did they understand the classification of different pornography? And I said, after thinking about it, it might be a good opportunity to meet with those men who were sitting around having those long chats about footy and talking about other things. Hopefully, there'll be a good opportunity to talk to them. And I said, so I'd do it providing I would have the opportunity to talk to them about things other than pornography. And so I got the job to do, and I travelled around the territory. I think I went to about 30 odd communities in a year, met with groups of men, and I found out some interesting things, some really interesting things. One was that in any community, there was always a small group of men who cared about the community. They wanted good things to happen. They wanted to help families when dad was dragged off to jail or things didn't work out and there was violence and whatever happening. These were the small group of men who cared for people on that community and wanted to do good things. But I found alarmingly at the same time, there was also another group of men almost about the same size of, let's call them good men. These were men who just wanted us all to go away, mind our business, had nothing to do with us. And in the middle was the bigger group, a much bigger group of men who didn't really realise where they fitted in relation to those two extremes and hadn't thought about it too much. So I got to talk to them about a whole range of things. We'd sit down, we'd talk about footy for an hour, maybe 2 hours or whatever. And then I'd say to them, let's talk pornography. What do you know about the classifications, blah, blah, blah. Let me say at this point, I didn't find that much pornography on those communities where I went. It wasn't that that they didn't have access to it, but they certainly weren't buying it because they simply couldn't afford it. They were getting their hands on pornography that was put there by the visiting tradesmen who were doing work on those communities. This is all heading in some direction. I want you to stay with me if you can. So we talked a little bit about pornography, and then I asked them about things like child protection, child abuse. Do you understand what child abuse was? And they tell me that they did understand it, but I actually put them to the test one day. I said, I'll talk for 15 minutes about football. You make a mark on that piece of paper in front of you every time you hear a word that you don't understand. And in the 15-minute talk, there were like 20 words that they didn't understand. They just didn't understand it, and they didn't understand child abuse either. They said to me they understood child abuse to mean swearing at your children, and that they've been having talks about how not to swear in front of their children. So they were getting on the track a little bit. I also asked them about domestic violence, family violence. Do you know much about family violence? Does it happen on this community? Now, it was interesting their response to it, because if they said no, they didn't know about it, I knew that they did know about it because the police had already given me the stats on that community. There were high levels. So I knew when they said no that they were lying to me. And if they weren't willing to talk about it, it meant they were ashamed about it. They were embarrassed about it. So they knew it wasn't a good thing. And if they said yes to it, and I had the stats that told me that was the case, I knew there was an opportunity for us to actually work with that smaller group of men. So it was a lot of difficult work that we'd actually done for a lot of time. But part of the work that we were doing had an important thing that I've always wanted to do, and that was to empower the community to come up with plans to do something about it rather than hear how bad it was. Always be able to say, so what do you think you should do about that issue? It's the old community development type model. And I often think when I look back to the past where these sort of programs were operating, that if we go back and revisit them, maybe they'd be better today than they were back then. Maybe they didn't work for reasons that didn't support them at that time, but maybe today they would. So I was always mindful of that. And one day I was talking to a group of men, Walpri men from Yuendamu. I think there was about 30 or 40 men in the room. And I told them, this was in 2006. I said, do you know in Australia now in 2006, 500,000 victims of family violence every year. 500,000, 500,000. I wrote it on the board and showed it to them, 5 with all those zeros after it. And I said to them, if you to look at that very closely, you'll realise that's one every minute. One every minute in this country, our country, the lucky country. And I said, if you're playing football for 60 minutes, every time you walk off, 60 more victims of family violence. And an old man got up, Jacomara Nelson, and he walked across the floor and he walked in front of my face and he shook his finger in front of my face like this and he said, no more, no more. And I understood what no more meant. It meant, let's get rid of it. We don't want it. It shouldn't be here. And I felt strongly about that. And I went to another community nearby to Yuendamu, a little place called Yulamu, and I spoke to the men and I said, those old Walpri men back there, when I talked about family violence to them, they said no more. And another old Walpri man got up, Ned Hargraves, and he walked up to me and he said, well, all men should link up. All men should link up. And I drove back from Yuendamu and Yulamu back to Alice Springs with those two messages in my head, no more and men should link up. And from that, the idea of having men link their arms when they walk out to play sport would be a symbolic statement that they make that they stand against family violence. And it was a strong and powerful message that they were actually given. And we knew, because evidence we were given, that when they did that, there'd be a drop in number of family violence issues that were happening in the region where people were seeing it. So I think I've just about run out of time, but that's just a bit of a snapshot of my background and why I'm involved in this. And from that, those two messages that I took from those old men, we finally got funding to start up a No More campaign that spread right across the Northern Territory. Everywhere you go now in those communities, they'll automatically go out and link arms before footy matches. They get closer to their community. The women are trusting the men more than they have in the past, even though now we know there's high numbers of violence still happening around the Northern Territory, and there's still so much work to do. I'm glad to be on this webinar today to share that message with you. The answers do lie out there, and it's easy for us to get exhausted at the end and we want to give up and go and do something else, but we're committed to the long haul, and I think that's really important. Get the language right when we're dealing with First Nations people or Aboriginal people or however you want to call us. Get it right so that make sure they understand what we're talking about, and I think we'll be able to make a difference. We've hung in there for such a long time, and we've developed things like Men Behaviour Change Program and all those other things as a result of those old men saying, and Natalie, back in those days, no more, no more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was just incredibly powerful, and I'm sure we will all leave today with the resounding messages of those elders of no more, and ensuring that men link together. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and share your wisdom of how we can really move forward together. Thank you. We also have on today's panel the ARC or ARC Gender Relations team, Sarah, Lisa and Hunter. ARC Gender Relations is a primary prevention of violence project on Bundjalung country in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. The ARC team have been using gender transformative approaches and intersectional feminist frameworks to deliver a broad range of innovative primary prevention and early intervention initiatives. ARC team, welcome. You've been working with men in New South Wales, and I would like to invite you to add your thoughts to the question: when have you faced resistance in the course of your working life? What happened and how did you address it?
Thanks, Natalie, for that question, and thanks to Our Watch for the opportunity to be part of this inspiring panel. Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Anglo-Celtic appearance, wearing a black top. Today we're going to talk to you on a very micro level about some of the backlash and resistance that we have experienced, so really on that individual level that Sarah was talking about before. We run an ARC Dads program. It is a 10-week group program aimed at male identified caregivers of children. Knowing that men's motivation around their children can assist them to seek support, this group aims to not only give skills, frameworks and knowledge about how to be an active caregiver and build connection with children, but also uses the men's engagement around parenting to introduce and explore gender inequality and the drivers of violence. We definitely experience resistance and backlash during these groups, and this is one specific example that we wanted to talk to you about today. The group facilitators had been noticing in the breaks that participants were engaging in talk that reflected the objectification of women. So during the group, when one of the participants referred to a woman that he was speaking about as a chick, I asked him in the spirit of our group agreements that are about actively practicing respect, if he could think of a different word than chick. At this point, another group member said, "What is wrong with calling someone a chick? How is that disrespectful? Did you just make that up?" And another group participant who had participated in other groups that we run here at the Men and Family Centre said, "Oh, they all think that here." So using curiosity, tentativeness, self-disclosure and flexibility, we decided to let go of some of the content of the night session and spend time in a conversation about this. Some of the important questions, thoughts and perspectives that we employed during this conversation were: when do you notice this word is used? Is it used to refer to all women or just particular groups of women? Is there a sexualised tone in the use of this word? What would they think if someone referred to their teenage daughter as a chick? Participants were invited to talk with women in their circles about how they viewed the use of this word or being called a chick. And I talked to my personal experiences of feeling that this word was used to belittle and or sexualise. And as we'd done a group activity around masculine gender stereotypes a couple of weeks before this conversation that had explored the rules of the man box and how they reinforce the social construction of gender hierarchy, we also explored how this word connected in with that.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm speaking to you from Bundjalung country and would like to acknowledge the Widjabul Waiable people. I'm a white woman wearing black glasses and a black shirt. As you've seen, the 2022 publication Understanding and Monitoring Backlash and Resistance and Backlash looks at different types of resistance and backlash that range from passive to active. So using this model, I would locate the backlash that Lisa is speaking about on the passive end of the spectrum as a type of denial. One of the ways resistance might present itself in the form of denial, as Sarah mentioned earlier, is denying the legitimacy of the issue by attacking the credibility of the messengers of change, by impugning on their motives and marginalising them as a special interest group. So the comment, "they all think that here," could be locating the whole organisation as coming from a different or strange place and suggest that suspicion is warranted. But in a further reading of the men's comments, we could think with curiosity again about these questions. Where are they coming from? Where are they at now? And what are they bringing and why? Resistance like this shows some kind of engagement with the topic, not outright refusal to engage. Could it be that the men are in a process of wrestling with the ideas and the language? Perhaps instead of seeing it as deliberately oppositional, we could see it as a continuation of a conversation about a set of ideas that are very new to these men. In this work and in any work, shouldn't we be encouraging critical thinking and be supporting the men to engage in a critical way with all information? In the same way we're hoping to move beyond passive denial, we're hopefully not looking for passive acceptance. We actually want people to wrestle with the concepts and for any change made to be real and not just attempts to pacify us or impress us as the agents of change.
Sarah. My name's Hunter, and I would like to acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am a white, queer, trans man. I'm wearing black glasses and a white shirt and quite a bit of jewellery. So if we go back to Sarah's questions, where are these men coming from? Where are they at now? What are they bringing and why? Resistance does not occur in a vacuum. It is useful to explore and understand the wider context of a person who is bringing resistance. So we can begin to bring an intersectional lens to what is happening for these men. Our team work in a rural and regional area of New South Wales with significant elements of socio-economic disadvantage. Half of the group members were flood affected and in precarious short-term housing situations while attending the ARC dance group. One of the men was facing the possibility of a custodial sentence. All of these men have histories of complex childhood trauma. None of these men identify themselves as having power in the world. When we talk to them about the use of the word chick being about gender and power, how do we support them to understand that? And how do we do that when these men come to our service for a couple of hours a week and then go back to their lives where they receive all the normative socio-cultural messages about rigid gender stereotypes? We understand that group work is relational work and that we need to meet people where they are at and walk alongside them. We cannot coerce people to change their attitudes and behaviours. We must also manage our own expectations of the change that is possible and indeed the change that we want to make happen. We want change for their partners, for their children, and for the men themselves. And we know that meeting resistance with patience and curiosity, time and time again, is a necessary part of that change process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, Hunter, and Sarah, for sharing those really important insights with us all today. Our third panelist is Marcella Brassett from Democracy in Colour. Marcella has worked as a trainer, author, campaigner, organiser, and has expertise in cross-cultural coaching, facilitation, and empowerment of people with lived experience of intersectional racism to speak to the media, transform structures, and lead public conversations on racism, gender, and human rights. Marcella, are there similarities for you when working on intersectional racism? And can you provide your reflections on the panel question of when you have faced resistance in the course of your work and life, what happened and how did you address it?
Thank you very much, Natalie. My name is Marcella. My pronouns are she, her, and I am on Wurundjeri lands. I'm a woman of colour. I have short black curly hair and I'm wearing a colourful blue and red top. Thank you so much for having me. Before I tell my story, I would really like to acknowledge the incredible work that has been done by the people on this panel and the people at Our Watch. Listening to you, Charlie, and listening to you at ARC, how powerful your work is. And I work with frameworks of transformative justice and racial and gender justice, as well as emergent work, and that is deeply relational, and that's where the change can be done, and that curiosity and love that we work with is so powerful for making change. So very honoured to be here with you. I would like to tell you my story. I'm a survivor of gendered violence and complex childhood trauma. I had the very amazing good fortune of being on Twitter at the right time when March for Justice was being organised in 2021, where a bunch of women came together in rage at what was happening in Parliament and how Scott Morrison and Christian Porter and the LNP government was behaving and treating women and treating gendered violence in Parliament. And I want to tell you the story of my experience of organising March for Justice, which was a very powerful moment in our history, but also organised in 10 days. So the amount of intensity and work that we did, threw up so many things for all of the women that organised it. I was the only woman of colour in the national organising team, and perhaps the whole thing, I'm not sure, all of the people who were organising it. And I'll tell you a little bit about what happened. So one of my roles in the March for Justice movement was finding speakers for every march in each state. And I was making sure that there were First Nations women and women of colour speaking at every event. There was a lot of resistance and backlash in many forms from all sides for the women who were organising the march. People who were helping organising the march, people on social media, within and without the movement. A speaker position was highly coveted. There was limited time and we were organising a national event in 11 days, and it was incredibly dynamic and very stressful for everyone, but very powerful at the same time. It was a moving feast that came together because of many women volunteering their time, working day and night, and putting out a lot of fires. One person who I considered my ally said to me in one phone conversation, "Why do we need diverse women? If it's so hard to get them, why do we even need them?" I spent a long time explaining to her why. Other organisers in one state kept removing names from the spreadsheet of names of women of colour and First Nation speakers that I had added without even communicating with me. I had to chase them and make sure that they stopped removing those names and those women had a place on the speaker list. In contrast to that, many Aboriginal women, including high-profile people, got back to me with much kindness and support. When they couldn't speak, they recommended others I could ask, and were really supportive and loving towards me and my efforts to make sure that they were First Nations women represented. Then there was the backlash on social media. People were calling it a white women's march. And no one really saw the efforts that we were making to make sure that we got diverse speakers. One white woman even tagged an Aboriginal woman in a tweet with an old social media tile that outlined all of the speakers and pointed out that the Aboriginal woman wasn't on the speakers list there, and that I had, and that I had messed up and I was silencing her. And I had to manage that. I had to call the Aboriginal women and explain, I'm sorry, that was an old tile. Here is a new one, and we're going to be putting that on our social media. The people who were given, and also moving back out, the people who were given credit for the march were mostly in the media, were mostly celebrities and journalists. Lisa Wilkinson, Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins. They were amazing. They were amazing representatives and amazing activists. But the women who did all the work of organising that march were not seen, especially as a woman of colour. That silence, around my work and the hardship that I experienced was not documented. Call-out culture is a huge part of backlash. People tend to want to incite rage, but don't want to look at the complexity of people's experiences. People want simple answers and solutions to a massively complex and intersectional problem of racism. There is a real lack of literacy around race in Australia. We really don't understand the structures and the intersections that cause violence, yet women of colour and Aboriginal women tend to suffer the most violence, or a large proportion of violence. Conversations don't include us. They don't have to include us. There is no accountability in the movement and no reason to do any work for transformative change to include women of colour and First Nations women in the conversation as representatives. Those who do this work are often beaten up from all sides, and we have a massive emotional load to carry. We hold spaces for everyone. We hold spaces for our communities, and we hold space to deal with the resistance from the dominant groups. And I want to also just acknowledge what Charlie said about the men in Yuendamu and the Warlpiri men that he encountered. And let's look at how Aboriginal women and men of colour are stereotyped in broader conversations, including in the movement, as inherently violent, that violence, is part of their culture. And yet look at the powerful way that they, Warlpiri men responded so quickly to form the No More campaign. And how often do we see that, in broader communities and in broader conversations? So that racism and that stereotyping and that exclusion is actually a lie. It's not the truth. And often the truth and the stories of truth are not told. And this is some of the ways that structures exclude people and perpetuate racist stereotypes, and also just, isolate people like me who are trying to do the work, people like us who are in the movement and trying to make that change. And we often do it alone. And that's why it's so important to have accomplices and allies, and to really educate everyone about how these structures exclude and harm people, and also just do the work of transformative justice, such as you are doing at ARC, with curiosity and patience, but also responsibility and accountability. So I would just like to, thank you for having me, and call on everyone to educate and to look for people and to support them, especially women and First Nations, women of colour and First Nations people doing this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcella. Incredibly powerful call to action there at the end to educate and empower people that are especially from backgrounds of colour or First Nations people. We're going to just take a moment to, as best we virtually can, thank all of our panel members for sharing their incredible insights and expertise with us in answering that important question of what resistance has looked like in their work. I'm now going to invite Dr. Sarah Hewitt back to talk to us about what we can do to take action on resistance, and explain a framework for people practicing in the prevention against violence against women space. And then we will move back after hearing from Sarah to our panel and invite them for their further thoughts. So thanks so much, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Wow, what an incredible group of people and their stories, including their personal stories and how they have shown a huge amount of resilience in responding to resistance and backlash. I was just sitting here listening and absorbing it, and I'm sure after the webinar going to take deep reflection with the team about all of those experiences. And in every panel member, they kind of touched on what part 2 of this webinar is about, which is to think solutions. So if resistance and backlash is inevitable or highly likely to transformative change, and as you said, Natalie, after the first part, these more extreme versions of backlash are everyday for many people in the community. How can we plan for it, and how can we prepare to respond to it? So Change the Story outlines several ways to plan for and integrate strategies to address various forms of resistance and backlash. And I won't go over them today, but I point you towards that resource for some tips around that and some strategies around that. What I'd like to highlight is really identifying and observing and documenting how backlash and resistance as reinforcing factors for violence against women and other forms of oppression manifest and change over time, because doing all of that work is really important in informing strategies. And proactively addressing this can create opportunities to effectively influence and persuade people to recognise the links between gender inequality, other intersecting forms of oppression and discrimination, power and privilege, and violence against women. So I think what's also really important to highlight is, some people may never accept responsibility for their part in the change process. And it's a really important thing to remember. You're not going to convince everyone in the community about primary prevention and the links between gender inequality and violence. There will always be a group that is never going to come to the table. You just need to make them the less dominant group. The goal is to educate and bring as many people along the journey of preventing violence against women. And we can think of those people as the movable middle, as a couple of the panelists touched on. So the individuals and communities that can be persuaded to support primary prevention and change processes and gender and other forms of equality. We can think about dealing with resistance in 2 ways. The first is to minimise its impacts by planning for how it might manifest, anticipate from whom and where resistance may emerge. And this should always be considered, as resistance can change over time and in different settings and contexts. Finding the right levers to overcome resistance can be really, really challenging. What works in one context may not be successful in another. And further, some of the strategies may not be accessible or possible in your positions or in your organisations, which is why shared learning and discussions about resistance can be helpful to identify successful and creative ways to respond. So there are several elements that we can put in place, and I'll just go through a couple just to save time. So first one I want to touch on is around leadership. If we were going to think of a community, organisational or institutional setting we're trying to implement a change initiative in, leadership endorsement is incredibly important for effective prevention work. Having leaders on board can help put in place mechanisms, structures, and foster a culture that consciously and intentionally supports equality and respect and works to challenge and shift the gender drivers of violence against women. Whether it's for a large workplace or a small sporting organisation, this requires identifying the key actors who have formal and informal influence, who can help to change formal mechanisms, policies and procedures, as well as influence the informal modes of group culture and those around them. But it's really important to work with leaders where they are at, because we need to build their capacity for them to be informed and committed to prevention, to support, drive and sustain change. Formal and informal leaders can bring others on board, create an environment that is conducive to gender equality and prevention, and empower individuals to speak up and take action when they see sexist or discriminatory behaviour, knowing that they will be supported. Leadership support helps ensure the allocation of adequate resources and time on addressing the gender drivers and intersectional issues. So securing this and maintaining leadership can minimise resistance and backlash and help cascade the central tenets of primary prevention throughout the organisation, its stakeholders and broader community. The second element I'd like to touch on is consultation, an unrealistic zero to hero approach that tries to implement something too big, too fast, that the setting or community or audience is not ready for, is going to produce resistance. Consultation before an initiative or change program has begun provides an opportunity for stakeholders to provide feedback and to reflect on and identify the ways in which gender influences and shapes norms, practices and structures in people's lives. Perhaps for the first time, it can start the conversation around gender. And I think Lisa, Hunter and Sarah, in their kind of discussion around that, really gave a great example of how to encourage those conversations and that thinking. So this could be done through consultation, could be done through several ways, such as through formal mechanisms, like a survey, but also informally through conversations. So this can be as simple as inviting someone to share their thoughts on topics like what keeps them up at night. It is an opportunity to ask people who may have never previously had the time or the inclination or the understanding to think about it, how does gender impact your lives? And encourage reflection and discussion on this. And this might involve, for example, highlighting the gender division of labour, who does what at home, or women's safety, such as how comfortable are you walking home at night with headphones on, or the type of work women do outside the home, or discussing examples of gender stereotyping that people have seen or experienced. Consultation can help foster openness and create a foundation for future work and assists in identifying where pockets of resistance, but also identify where is the support and allyship exist or have the potential to emerge in the audience you're engaging with. The third element I'd like to touch on is communication and messaging. A communication plan that integrates considerations of backlash and resistance is really key in this work. The objectives of prevention and an explanation of the gender drivers of violence against women need to be clearly articulated and tailored to suit an audience, including opportunities for specific training and knowledge dissemination of why prevention is necessary if that is accessible. For example, in an organisation such as a workplace, school, government body or department, communication channels are an opportunity to introduce primary prevention as a strategy that may align with organisational values. By effectively communicating the change process, both what the organisation is doing and the goals and reasons behind these actions, an organisation may help mitigate any fears and anxieties about the impacts of primary prevention and gender equality initiatives that may inadvertently drive those more passive forms of resistance. And I point people towards the values-based messaging that Common Cause has developed as a super helpful way in starting to think about communicating in values-based ways. And the last element I'd like us to consider is around establishing partnerships, allies and networks in doing this work that Marcella touched on in her discussion. Driving change alone can be really difficult and overwhelming. And so finding others in similar positions, implementing primary prevention across different settings enables people to learn from their challenges and successes, including how to respond to resistance and backlash. Connecting to share learning and best practice is essential for progressing this work and finding new and innovative ways to minimise resistance, to understand what has worked and what has worked less well, which is why the webinar today, I think, is a really great place to start those conversations and make those connections. The second way to think about overcoming resistance is to respond. Responding to resistance, especially with individuals, as the group ARC so beautifully described, requires patience and curious practice and an effort to find those points of connection whether they are shared values or shared experiences. Maintaining a curious perspective as to why someone is displaying resistance is super important, as already mentioned, and can be aided by using open-ended questions like, can you tell me more about this? To seek clarification around resistant views. Being curious can often prompt those resisting to think more about the reasons why. And these types of conversations must be supported with evidence, information, and data to ensure you have a good foundation to have those discussions. And an important thing to remember is a lot of the time in responding to individuals and collectives, other people may be watching. So it can also be an opportunity to educate onlookers who may be part of the movable middle. But if an individual or collective is displaying more aggressive forms of backlash, you also have to weigh up whether their views and position is ever going to be moved and whether the precious time and resources that is required convincing them otherwise is worth it. But some ways to respond for us to consider can include, really making sure you illustrate and emphasise the ways violence against women is a societal and structural problem to counter the individualisation of perpetration of violence. It's also really important to remember that individual people also have experiences of violence, and it is important to view those people as just generally as whole persons than a one-dimensional resistant person only. Approaching resistant people in formally inappropriate ways may help you understand reasons for resistance. And something that can also help is around establishing shared values, experiences, forms of privilege, which can help people start to see and understand gender dynamics. So throughout planning for and responding to resistance and backlash, however, a principle of maintaining accountability to women and victim survivors and addressing the gender drivers of violence as identified in the evidence base is central and foundational to this work. This principle must never be left behind to try and convince someone to kind of move into that, to move away from kind of those opposing attitudes and behaviours. So in all of this, I think it's good to come back to what we want to achieve. If we want to challenge resistance and backlash and move the movable middle to become supporters of primary prevention and commit to gender equality and other intersecting transformational change processes, for every form of resistance, we can think of an opposing solution so that when the resistance does feel really overwhelming or too challenging to overcome, we can point to this as, this is where we want to get this person, this group, this organisation or institution. We can think of it as a framework for action. For example, for the 3 forms of resistance we looked at earlier, for denial, you may want to draw attention to the problem and emphasise the gender dynamics as the underlying drivers of violence against women. You want to give credence to victim survivors' experiences and voice and promote the evidence base and the input of researchers, policymakers and advocates and acknowledge their expertise. For co-option, you may want to promote positive dialogue, ensure accountability, and I think something that's really important is protecting and sustaining the evidence base and building solidarity to take steps to unblock barriers. And for backlash, this solution is framed as safety and well-being. Given many individuals and collectives who exhibit backlash may not be convinced about primary prevention and gender equality, it is critical to put in place processes to ensure the safety, care, and security of practitioners, advocates, and communities working on rights-based social change, and create spaces where individuals and collectives who display backlash and seek to dismantle and repress progress are not amplified. So I think that's where I'm out of time. And I hope finishing on some of those outcomes and solutions of what we want to see have left people with a way forward to thinking about minimising and responding to backlash and resistance. What I will mention is this is an evolving evidence base in terms of what works and what works less well. So we encourage sharing of insights with peers and colleagues on how to do this work, or alternatively in the Q&A function in the chat today, share some experiences if you feel comfortable to do so. But thanks so much for listening, and I hope this has provided you with some reflections around overcoming the challenges that are so common in prevention and broader equality work. I'll pass back to you, Natalie, and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was really incredible. And I think always when we are having these conversations about some of the most significant impacts on our prevention work in the violence against women space, it's really important to have a better understanding about how we can properly address backlash and resistance. So thank you. I'm going to invite our panel back to the virtual floor and reflect panelists on how useful it is to hear that there is a framework that we can use for doing advocacy and campaigning and discover a lot of resistance to the messages that we're working on. I'm going to invite each of you to speak about advice that you would give your younger self. But I wanted to start with Charlie and specifically ask you, if I may, for the people here in the webinar, what wisdom would you like to share with them for moments when resistance presents itself? Over to you, Charlie.
Natalie, thank you. There is soft resistance and there's hard resistance. I think we've met much of that in our work life. People who you talk to about family domestic violence, and they say things like, "Oh yeah, that's a problem, isn't it?" But that's soft resistance, because you know that 7 seconds after you've walked outside, they've forgotten all about it. Hard resistance comes from people often referred to as dinosaurs. These are the older men in particular who, when we talk to sporting clubs and say, you know, this is a big problem, blah, 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 here are the stats, they say, we're here to win footy matches. That's what we're here to do. We're here to win the game. That's what it's all about. So it's, but dealing with it is you have to make a decision about whether you want to work with the hard resistors or the soft resistors. So sometimes we have to pick it, because you can't do it all. You know, you're going to have to work with some. So you look to get some achievable outcome. So you then work with a soft resistor. If you want to, you know, something that's going to take much longer, then you work with a hard resistor. That's what I want to add. And also what was just said then about the movable middle. Can I just talk for a minute about that? When I was talking before on those communities where there's a small group of men who want to do good things and a bad group of men who just wish it all go away, to try and empower that middle group to move more towards the good people on their community who want to do the good things and do care, to make that seen as an important thing by encouraging them, that small group, to actually get in and mix with more powerful people from outside, like, you know, could be an AFL football coach who visits, that if they could be seen to be in the company of that person, this is very minor stuff, but it has an effect that more people on the community will actually see them as people who are doing the right thing, not the wrong thing. So just wanted to add that to it. Can I also say that what has led to us to really deeply engage with these communities that we're working with is to come up with the idea of a thing we call a DVAP, Domestic Violence Action Plan, which sort of in some ways copies a RAP, a Reconciliation Action Plan, except it is about domestic violence. So to get and to see this happening on some of those small remote communities who have high levels of violence happening is such a good thing for them to actually help develop a DVAP that clearly outlines what their sporting club and what their community is aiming to do to stop the violence that is actually happening. That is engaging and empowering people to do what they think is best for their community. So we're always heartened to see that. The other work we've been doing in recent times is...
Charlie, we lost you there. You've just gone on mute again.
It's turning itself off. It's getting tired of me. Sorry about that. Yes, behaviour change program. There's only 2 behaviour change programs in the Northern Territory, one in Alice Springs and one in Darwin. But it does work with men who can either be referred directly to come and be part of it or actually want to do it themselves. So it does a power of good work, and we'd like to see that being considered to happen in other parts around Australia where behaviour change is a responsibility for a community to do something about it. Also, the other thing I just wanted to mention too was that that the idea of engaging to empower is about, it's the old community development model. It's about saying to the community, what is it you want to do? How do you want to do it? How can we help you do what you want to do? We think that's a good way of working with it and with those communities. And I think that if you want to work out how you're travelling in that respect and engaging to empower, we say, ask yourself these three questions. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? What difference will it make? And if the difference is it's going to make it a safer community so that women and children are safer, that's a better thing for us. Look, I think I have to go to another meeting in a moment, but I just wonder, is there anything else, Natalie, you wanted to ask me to say before I have to go?
No, Charlie, look, that has been such exceptional and insightful wisdom. We are indebted with gratitude for your time and expertise that's been shared today. I can absolutely let you go to your next meeting. Thank you so much for being with us.
All right, can I just add before I leave? In Aboriginal society, there are elders, and they're elders because they are not because of age, it's because of their wisdom. And in the non-Aboriginal community, they are seniors. And I think there's a real opportunity for us all to do more work engaging with the seniors and the elders, because they will have ideas that we want to unpick with them and help them develop strategies to reduce family violence where it is happening across Australia. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I wish I had more time to say, but you're probably all aware there's a big grand final coming up soon. I've got extra work that I have to go and do. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks so much, Charlie, again, and our deepest gratitude. So, Marcella, I'd like to come to you. And if we look back on your earlier times working on gender and racial justice, what advice would you give yourself about working with people and systems that are resistant to change?
Thank you, Natalie. The advice I'd give to my younger self, I started this work quite, probably I'm 10 years behind, actually. But I wish that I'd started this work earlier as a young person and had access to these networks and communities earlier for my own professional development, but also for my own personal safety and strength and power. And so just engaging younger people is really important, because it gives them that time and helps them develop younger people of, from First Nations and people of colour. I also would tell myself never, ever, ever to do this work alone, which I have found myself doing often, being the only woman of colour in white spaces and white dominated organisations. I would tell myself to find a group of people who have the same values and goals and to work with them. The cost is too great to bear, and the backlash and the resistance, the cost of the backlash and the resistance is often personal, and it's too great to bear alone. So I would, advise everyone to only do this work in a collective, and to build trust with people around you. And so you can do the work together. There are also, I would tell myself, there are also many allies and accomplices out there, people who understand, people who have experienced and have lived experience, or are deeply, supportive and understanding. Social media can be used to find some of them. I know I have done that and work with them, as well as there can be a lot of backlash and resistance on social media, but it is also a place of finding community. I want to use an example of how fiercely Magda Sabansky defended Niadol, who's a very powerful African-Australian woman spokesperson and intellect, from so much racism on social media, and to have that fierce allyship and that fierce defense from women and people is really powerful to heal and to heal from racism. And many women do this for each other. We help each other, we support each other, and we grow together. So we have to find each other and work with each other to build strength and to hold space and to keep each other and ourselves safe. I would also tell myself to do healing work every day, to do the work of consciously and intentionally healing the hurt and the trauma that I've suffered from racism, from the gendered violence, from multiple things that I experience, intersectional things that I experience as a working class woman of color, and the lack of opportunities, the microaggressions, all of the things. I need to heal if I'm going to continue doing this work, and I need to practice self-care and self-love relentlessly and consistently, and to access knowledge of how to do that and support networks of how to heal. We get hurt a lot doing this work from facing backlash and resistance, and we need to heal if we want to continue. And we also need to learn, it's a skill, to learn and to build our capacity in how to create safety for ourselves and each other, from people who are experts in how to do this, and also to educate ourselves in how to create safety and healing. So that's what I would tell my younger self. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcella. That's incredibly rich and insightful, and I'm sure of great assistance to everyone here. Grace, I would like to come to you now, and looking back on your early work and life experience, what advice would you give yourself or others about working with people and systems that are resistant to change?
Yeah, a lot of what's been said I relate to as well. Honestly, something that really jumped to mind reading this was like, don't panic that you have a brain tumor so quick, get to a neurologist before a psychiatrist gets to you, because it's ridiculously difficult to be taken seriously when you say, I think something's actually physically wrong with me, once you're in the mental health system. So I think that would be a big one, would be, kid, you really do have a brain tumor. And I know I'm saying that sort of lightheartedly, but seriously, it's a really big thing, medical gaslighting, and the resistance and backlash to that within the medical system from medical professionals can be huge. It can be traumatic and surprising when you're actually in those systems, the way that you're spoken to when you're raising a very legitimate concern. So alongside that, I would say trust your gut. You have a very strong gut instinct, and you know that. So if someone with more power than you tells you you're completely wrong or delusional, but you have this really strong gut instinct that you're onto something there, go with your gut, stick to it, and don't just trust someone because of their position of power or their expertise, something external and constructed like that, because strength and power are two very, very different things. You might not have power, you might be actively disempowered, but that doesn't mean that you don't have strength. Also, you're autistic, so you should probably know that. Now that we've got that out of the way, for me, working with systems and people that are really resistant to change and I do go back to the psychiatric institutional abuse, because I think that is a voice that I don't hear in many places as much as I would like to. Don't think vertically. Think in terms of sprawl in being heard, but in also creating change, like urban sprawl in geography. Think like that. So you don't have to climb to the person with the biggest office at the top of the same building that hurt you and convince them, change it, listen to me, because it's likely that the person with most power in the same system of power that's silencing and hurting you in the first place will actually just have more power to do just those same things. So when you speak out and they don't believe you, and their boss doesn't believe you, and then their boss doesn't believe you, and then you drag yourself through this official complaint system, and somehow the further on through it you get, it seems like it all just disappears, like it never even happened. That means that you should actually leave, that you should stop trying that process and leave the building, because you can now. Once you can leave a building that you used to be locked in, don't go back into it. Because if possible, the system of harm doesn't have to be your system of healing. And despite its best attempts, that system of power doesn't have to be your system of thought, even though that is what they set out to do. So think outside the building, think outside that particular system, and find communities of solidarity, like what's already been said. Find support and strength, and know that those people who don't believe you and that place where they keep you, you don't need them anymore. And the reason you don't need them is because you actually never did. And also, everything you've ever experienced or read or seen or listened to and learned, that's always going to be there for you to draw on. And you will, even if you're not realizing you're doing it. I grew up playing and listening to music, and that's woven through the way that I think. And one of my favorite musicians is Sinead O'Connor, the late Sinead O'Connor. One of my favorite songs is Famine. And unexpectedly tearing up a picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live reminds me of something my younger self would do. And sharing my story has seen similar, albeit smaller reactions. There will be people who don't want to hear what was done to you, because it might go just beyond the palette of trauma porn for the time being, or they might not be ready to hear it. But you don't have to wait for them to be ready for it. You do have to wait for yourself to be ready to say it. And you already believe that everything grievous deserves to be remembered and to be known beyond the people who were wounded by it, and to be grieved as something that should never have happened, and to be understood for something that we never should have let happen in the first place. And that's something you've known for a really long time for someone so young. I would also say that something I've only realized recently is that I think your queerness, which you currently think is a tendency to just make out with your friends at parties, gives you a very important insight that abuse isn't about sex or desire. It's an act of power. And use that knowledge. Use the knowledge that you get from things like your queerness once you realize. And find people who tell their stories, because I know that if I had access to stories like mine at the time, things would have gone really differently. And there'll be a lot less shame when stories stop feeling like secrets. And yeah, just go where the strong people are and where they believe you and where they want change like you do. Find your community of change, and you know what you know, and you know when something isn't right.
Thanks so much, Grace. That is just really, really powerful and incredible. I'm going to move finally to the ARC team, or ARC team, and really looking back on your work and life experiences. If you could briefly share with us the advice that you would give yourself and others about working with people and systems that are resistant to change.
Well, thanks, Natalie. So much connection with what Marcella and Grace and Charlie have said, and so much wisdom in what they've said. I mean, my advice to my younger self would be just, protect your heart. It's really essential to keep connected to hope. And so make sure that you do things to actively practice and connect with hope while you're doing this work. Use your cognitive skills mixed with a large proportion of curiosity so that resistance and difference become interesting, something to explore and understand rather than be threatened by or have to fix. Also remember to stay away from the binaries. I would say to myself, from your own history and heritage that we humans mostly occupy the grey continuums, and the world is not divided into good and bad people. And I'd also echo a lot of what's been said around practicing self-compassion and care and finding a solidarity team, making sure you regularly immerse yourself in nature in a way that leaves you physically tired and awestruck so that you can both draw strength from the natural world and be reminded of your own insignificance. And lastly, with dogged determination and intentionality, seek fun and joy as an antidote to the work you do.
Thanks, Lisa. I would advise myself to approach conversations with less righteousness and more curiosity. I think back on a lot of the combative and unconstructive conversations I've had that were really full of righteousness and pretty absent from curiosity, and I get a bit of a cringe. When we do men's behaviour change work, we support the men to disengage from black and white thinking and the feeling or belief of being absolutely right. And I think I've had some work to do in this area and still do to interrogate my feeling of being right when I'm having conversations with people who are bringing resistance. Alan Jenkins says that curiosity is the antithesis of violence, and I think with genuine curiosity comes respect. And it's hard to be curious and respectful if we're stuck in a mindset that's based in a binary of right and wrong. So yeah, dealing with resistance is relational work and largely based on building safety and rapport and having connected conversations that meet people where they're at. Often we might feel like those conversations aren't getting where we want to go or getting there as fast as we would like. But even just a little seed planted could grow into something more. And I think realising the relational nature of this work has supported me to embrace connection and real conversations with people, even if they think really differently to me, and even if I think their attitudes, beliefs and actions are harmful. And this is really more an interpersonal relational work rather than systems, in terms of, you know, what others have said as well, because I think go for your life with system. Part of relating to people is trying to regulate my own emotions and responses as well. So if I can regulate my own escalation and soothe my feelings that arise, that could be anger or sadness or frustration, I can maintain my curiosity and be more relatable in conversations with people as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I just want to say, Marcella, Grace, thank you so much for what you said. It was really meaningful and powerful for me. One of the great joys of the work that I get to do in this field, in violence prevention, and in this team is I'm surrounded by amazing, fierce, powerful, incredible women. And that's my privilege. So yeah, thank you, Lisa and Sarah. And thank you for your incredible words, all of you. What do I have to say? My younger self was very angry. It's been a long time since I was young. Life circumstances provided me with lots of practice at defending myself and fighting back. This was necessary and kept me alive, so I'm not going to advise my younger self to change that. I'm also the most stubborn person I know, which as a young person who did not conform to the rules of gender served me very well when coming up against individuals and systems that were resistant to me and the change that my very existence demanded of them. So go me, keep those fires burning, and to every young, queer, trans, black, non-normative person out there, be angry, be strong, be stubborn, fight the good fight, I say. Keep yourself safe, find your people. What I would say to my younger self is to be wary of letting your heart grow too hard. Stay open to the possibility of hope. You may need to practice patience because change and transformation take time, but are happening all around you. Believe in the goodwill of others, even if you cannot hear it in their words or see it in their faces. So now I practice consciously pausing, feeling the potential leap to anger. I take some breaths, slow my heart rate, and I lean in. Find a solid place on which to stand, a place where I can look the other person in the eye and truly see their humanity, and we go from there.
Wow. Just wow. That's really, really incredible. Thank you so much to our panelists, Charlie, who's of course zipped off the Marcella, Grace, and the ARC team. We are incredibly indebted to all of you, and of course Dr. Sarah Hewitt, for taking the time to be with us today and to share those important insights. We hope that today has provoked thought and provided you with the tools to prepare for or even harness the inevitable resistance that comes with social change and promoting justice on the path to violence prevention. Before we go, we would ask that you complete the feedback on today's event. Your response is critical to ensure that we can respond to the needs of the violence against women and prevention sectors when doing this work. So thank you very much again. Please be kind and safe with yourselves and with others, and enjoy the remainder of your afternoon in solidarity. Thank you.